The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as Captain Sarah Martinez walked through the mess hall. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. But what caught everyone's attention were the distinctive scars that ran along the left side of her face and neck. Pale lines against her olive skin that spoke of fire and pain. She had learned long ago to ignore the stares. Some were curious, others sympathetic. But today, there was a different energy in the air. A new batch of recruits had arrived at Fort Braxton, fresh-faced young men and women who thought they knew what courage looked like. They would learn soon enough. Sarah picked up her breakfast tray and scanned the room for an empty table. The usual spots were taken by seasoned soldiers who nodded respectfully as she passed. She had earned their respect the hard way, but these new recruits didn't know her story yet. To them, she was just another officer with visible battle wounds. "Look at that," she heard a voice snicker from a corner table. "They're letting anyone become an officer these days. Wonder what happened to her face." The voice belonged to Private Jake Morrison, a cocky 22-year-old from Texas who had arrived just 3 days ago. He sat with 5 other new recruits, all of them sharing nervous laughter at his comment. Morrison had been the star of his ROTC program and believed his family's military connections would fast-track his career. He saw everyone as either useful or beneath him. "Maybe she got too close to a campfire," another recruit whispered, causing more suppressed giggles. Sarah continued walking, her face expressionless. She had heard worse comments and had developed thick skin over the years. But Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who was sitting nearby, stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "You got something to say, Rodriguez?" Morrison called out, emboldened by his audience. "Just wondering if you know who you're talking about, recruit," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet mess hall. Morrison shrugged. "Some officer who maybe should have been more careful. My dad always said the best soldiers don't get scars because they know how to avoid trouble." The mess hall fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped their work. Sarah paused in her walk, not turning around but listening. She knew what was coming, and part of her almost felt sorry for Morrison. Almost. "Your dad say anything else about avoiding trouble?" Rodriguez asked, stepping closer to Morrison's table. "He said real warriors think before they act. They use strategy, not stupidity." Morrison was doubling down, unaware that he was digging his own grave. "I'm not trying to be mean, but facts are facts. Scars like that come from poor decision-making." An older sergeant near the back of the room muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "This kid's about to learn something." Other experienced soldiers exchanged knowing looks. They remembered when Sarah first arrived at the base 2 years ago. The quiet way she carried herself, and the respect she commanded without saying a word. Sarah finally turned around, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's blue ones across the room. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Her expression was calm, almost amused, as if she was watching a child play with matches near gasoline. "What's your name, recruit?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. Morrison straightened in his chair, suddenly realizing he was being directly addressed by a superior officer. "Private Morrison, ma'am." "Jake Morrison. Well, Private Morrison, you seem to have strong opinions about scars and the people who carry them." I was just making conversation, ma'am." Some of his earlier confidence was fading. Sarah nodded slowly. "I see. And tell me, what do you think qualifies someone to be an officer in this army?" Morrison glanced around at his fellow recruits, who were no longer looking at him with admiration. "Leadership skills, ma'am. Strategic thinking. The ability to keep soldiers safe." "Interesting perspective." Sarah took a step closer. "And you believe someone with visible scars has failed in those areas?" The recruit was beginning to sweat. "I didn't mean to imply." "Oh. But you did imply exactly that." Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You suggested that my scars represent poor decision-making and that real warriors avoid trouble altogether." Rodriguez was grinning now, along with several other veterans in the room. They knew what Morrison didn't, that he had just insulted one of the most decorated officers on the base, but they also knew Sarah could handle herself. "Ma'am, If I said something inappropriate, you did. But that's not unusual for new recruits. You're here to learn, after all. Sarah walked closer, and Morrison could see the full extent of her scars now. They were indeed from fire, but they were precise, deliberate-looking, not the random marks of an accident. Tell me, Private Morrison, what do you know about Medal of Honor recipients? Morrison blinked. They're heroes, ma'am, the highest honor in the military. And what about Special Operations Forces? What's your understanding of their role? Elite soldiers, ma'am. They handle the most dangerous missions. Sarah nodded. And call signs? Do you know how Special Ops personnel earn their call signs? Usually from something they did in the field, ma'am. Some act of courage or distinctive characteristic. The mess hall was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming. Morrison was beginning to realize he had walked into something much bigger than he understood. But he still didn't know exactly what. You mentioned your father's military experience, Sarah continued. What unit did he serve with? 82nd Airborne, ma'am. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Respectable service. I'm sure he taught you about honor and respect for fellow soldiers. Morrison nodded, his face now pale. Yes, ma'am. Sarah turned to address the entire mess hall. Private Morrison has raised an interesting question about scars and what they represent. I think this would be an excellent learning opportunity for all our new recruits. She looked back at Morrison. You see, Private, in about 30 minutes, General Patterson will be arriving for the monthly briefing. He likes to walk through the mess hall and meet new recruits personally. Morrison swallowed hard. Meeting a general on your first week was either a great opportunity or a terrible disaster, and he was beginning to suspect which one this would be. I'm going to suggest you ask the general about scars, Private Morrison, about how soldiers earn them and what they represent. I think you'll find his perspective educational. With that, Sarah turned and walked away, leaving Morrison sitting with his untouched breakfast and a growing sense of dread. Around the mess hall, veterans were shaking their heads and returning to their meals. The new recruits at Morrison's table were looking at him like he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. Dude, what just happened? One of them whispered. Morrison didn't answer. He was staring at the spot where Sarah had been standing, replaying every word of their conversation. Something about the way the other soldiers had reacted, the way Rodriguez had grinned, the way Sarah herself had remained so calm. It all suggested he had made a terrible mistake, but he still didn't understand exactly what he had done wrong. Sergeant Rodriguez approached their table, his expression serious now. You boys might want to finish up your breakfast. And Morrison? He leaned down close. When General Patterson gets here, you might want to keep your mouth shut and your ears open. You're about to get an education. As Rodriguez walked away, Morrison pushed his food around his plate, no longer hungry. Around him, the mess hall slowly returned to its normal noise level, but he could still feel eyes on him. He had wanted to make an impression on his first week, to show everyone that he was leadership material. Instead, he had a sinking feeling that he was about to become a cautionary tale. The clock on the wall ticked toward the general's arrival, and Private Jake Morrison had never wished more that he could take back words once spoken. 20 minutes before General Patterson's arrival, Sarah Martinez sat in her office reviewing personnel files for the new recruits. Her computer screen displayed Morrison's record. Excellent grades, strong physical fitness scores, and glowing recommendations from his instructors. On paper, he looked like ideal officer material, but paper didn't tell the whole story. She touched the scars on her face absently, a habit she had developed during quiet moments. The medical report in her own file described 2nd and 3rd degree burns covering 15% of her body, sustained during combat operations in classified theater. What it didn't describe was the sound of children screaming, or the split-second decision that had changed everything. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might need this before the circus starts. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. You didn't have to defend me in there, Rodriguez. I can handle a mouthy recruit. I know you can, Captain. But that kid has no idea what he's walking into. Rodriguez settled into the chair across from her desk. You going to tell him the whole story? That's up to General Patterson. He was there, after all. Rodriguez nodded. He had served under Patterson for 8 years, and knew the general had a special way of teaching lessons to cocky recruits. You want to know something funny? That kid Morrison reminds me of you when you first showed up. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I never mocked another officer's appearance. No. But you had that same confidence. That certainty that you knew how the world worked. Rodriguez sipped his coffee. Course. Back then you didn't have the scars. 3 years ago, Sarah had been Lieutenant Martinez, a rising star in Army intelligence with a specialty in counterterrorism operations. She spoke 4 languages fluently, had a master's degree in international relations, and had never seen combat. Her assignments were desk jobs in air-conditioned offices, analyzing data and writing reports that others would act upon. That changed on a Tuesday morning in a village outside Kandahar, when her convoy took a wrong turn. The explosion that destroyed the lead vehicle happened at 10:47 a.m. local time. Sarah's vehicle, second in line, immediately came under heavy machine gun fire from concealed positions. The planned 3-hour intelligence-gathering mission became a 12-hour siege that would test every assumption she had ever made about courage and leadership. Staff Sergeant Williams, the convoy commander, was killed in the initial blast. Corporal Hayes, their communications specialist, took shrapnel to the chest and was bleeding out. The remaining 6 soldiers looked to Sarah, the highest-ranking officer present, for orders. She had never commanded troops in combat. Her training was theoretical, learned in classrooms and simulation exercises. But as bullets shattered the windows of their armored vehicle, she discovered something about herself that no amount of training could have revealed. Rodriguez, can you get us to that building? She pointed to a partially destroyed schoolhouse about 50 meters away. Maybe, ma'am, but we'll have to carry Hayes. And we'll be exposed for at least 30 seconds. 30 seconds might as well have been 30 minutes under heavy fire. But staying in the disabled vehicle meant certain death. What about cover fire? Third, we can lay down suppression, but they've got us pinned pretty good. Sarah made her first combat decision. You and Martinez take Hayes to the building. I'll draw their fire. Rodriguez had stared at her. Ma'am, that's an order, Sergeant. What happened next would be debated in after-action reports for months. Sarah had deliberately exposed herself, moving to the most vulnerable position to draw enemy fire away from her wounded soldiers. She had no advanced combat training, no special operations background, just a determination that no soldier under her command would die if she could prevent it. The plan worked. Her soldiers reached the schoolhouse safely with the wounded Hayes, but Sarah's sprint to rejoin them was cut short by a rocket-propelled grenade that struck the building's fuel storage room just as she entered. The explosion brought down half the structure. Sarah was trapped under burning debris, her face and left arm catching the worst of the flames. For 8 minutes, she remained conscious, directing her soldiers' defensive positions, while flames ate at her uniform and skin. Captain Martinez? Rodriguez's voice brought her back to the present. You okay? Sarah blinked, realizing she had been staring out her window. Sorry. Just thinking about that day. Hayes still sends you Christmas cards, you know. His daughter's starting college next year. Donner de Downs 2026. Donner de Downs 26. Donner de Downs Donner de Down. Sarah smiled. Corporal Hayes had survived his wounds and made a full recovery. All 6 soldiers from that convoy had lived, thanks to decisions made by a lieutenant who had never fired a shot in anger before that morning. General Patterson promoted you from that hospital bed. Rodriguez continued. Said it was the clearest case of combat leadership he'd seen in 20 years. The official citation had been more formal. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. But Sarah remembered Patterson's actual words better. Lieutenant, you turned into the fire when every instinct told you to run away. That's what real officers do. Her recovery had taken 14 months. 3 surgeries to repair nerve damage, countless hours of physical therapy, and skin grafts that left the distinctive scars Morrison had mocked. But the hardest part wasn't the medical treatment. It was learning to see herself differently. Before the explosion, Sarah had been proud of her appearance. She had modeled part-time in college and was used to turning heads when she entered a room. The scars changed that forever. Some people stared, others looked away too quickly. She had to develop new confidence based on what she had done, not how she looked. "You know what's funny?" Rodriguez said, checking his watch. "That kid Morrison probably thinks he knows what courage looks like. Big muscles, perfect uniform, confident attitude. He'll learn," Sarah replied. "We all do, eventually." "Yeah, but some lessons are harder than others." A commotion in the hallway indicated that General Patterson had arrived early. Sarah could hear his distinctive voice greeting soldiers, asking about their families and their training. Patterson made a point of knowing every soldier's name and hometown. It was one of the reasons men and women would follow him anywhere. "Showtime," Rodriguez said, finishing his coffee and standing up. Sarah checked her appearance in the small mirror on her desk. The scars were clearly visible, as always, but she no longer tried to hide them. They were part of her story now. Evidence of a moment when she had chosen others' safety over her own. "Rodriguez?" she called as he reached the door. "Yes, ma'am? Make sure Morrison stays in the mess hall. I want him to hear this from the general directly." Rodriguez grinned. "Oh, he's not going anywhere. I've got Stevens and Park watching him. Kid looks like he's about to throw up." As Rodriguez left, Sarah gathered her files and prepared to join the general's briefing. Private Morrison was about to learn something about scars, about courage, and about the difference between confidence and arrogance. She almost felt sorry for him, but lessons like these were necessary. Young soldiers needed to understand that heroism rarely looked like what they expected. It wasn't always the biggest, strongest, or most confident person who stepped up when everything went wrong. Sometimes it was a scared lieutenant with no combat experience, who simply refused to let her soldiers die. Sarah Martinez had learned that lesson in Fire and Pain. Now it was Morrison's turn to learn it. Though hopefully with less dramatic consequences, the general would make sure of that. General Patterson entered the mess hall with his characteristic purposeful stride, immediately commanding the attention of everyone present. At 62, he was an imposing figure even in standard military fatigues, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The man had led troops in 4 different conflicts and had a reputation for being tough, but fair. "As you were," he called out as soldiers began to stand. "I'm here for the new recruit briefing. But first I want to meet some of our newest additions." Private Morrison felt his stomach drop as the general's gaze swept across the mess hall. Sergeant Stevens, who had been casually standing near Morrison's table for the past 10 minutes, stepped forward. "General Patterson, sir. This is Private Morrison and his group. They arrived 3 days ago." "Excellent." Patterson approached their table with a smile. "Stand up, soldiers. Let me get a look at you." The 6 recruits jumped to their feet, standing at attention with varying degrees of nervousness. Patterson walked down the line, stopping in front of each one to ask a few questions. Morrison watched as the general spoke with genuine interest to each recruit, asking about their backgrounds and their reasons for enlisting. Finally, Patterson reached Morrison. "And you are?" "Private Jake Morrison, sir. From Houston, Texas." "Morrison," Patterson repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to Colonel Robert Morrison, 82nd Airborne?" Morrison's face lit up slightly. "Yes, sir. He's my father. Outstanding officer. Served with distinction in Afghanistan. You planning to follow in his footsteps?" "Yes, sir. I hope to make it to special operations eventually." Patterson nodded approvingly. "Ambitious goals. That's good to see in a young soldier." The general paused, studying Morrison more carefully. "Tell me, son, what do you think makes a great officer?" Morrison straightened, pleased to have an opportunity to impress the general. "Leadership under pressure, sir. Strategic thinking. The ability to make tough decisions without hesitation." "Good answer. And what about courage? How would you define military courage?" Morrison thought for a moment. "Standing your ground when things get difficult, sir. Not backing down from a fight. Having the confidence to lead soldiers into danger." Oh, 5. Also, interesting perspective. Patterson's expression remained neutral. And tell me, have you had any opportunities to observe courage in action since arriving at Fort Braxton? Morrison glanced around the mess hall uncertainly. I'm not sure I understand the question, sir. Simple question. In your 3 days here, have you witnessed any acts of courage? Observed any officers or soldiers who embody the qualities you just described? Abunisen. 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 The mess hall had grown quiet again. Morrison could feel eyes on him from every direction. But he couldn't understand why this conversation felt like a trap. I haven't been in any dangerous situations yet, sir. Most of my interactions have been with other new recruits. I see. So you haven't had any memorable encounters with superior officers? Morrison's mouth went dry. Behind the general, he could see Sergeant Rodriguez watching with an expression that looked almost sympathetic. I've met several officers, sir. All very professional. Patterson smiled. But it wasn't a warm expression. Professional. Yes. Our officers are certainly that. The general's voice carried clearly across the room as he continued. You know, Private Morrison, I've been thinking about courage lately, about what it really means and how we recognize it. Sir, see, young soldiers like yourself often have very specific ideas about what courage looks like. Usually involves big dramatic gestures, charging into battle, that sort of thing. Very Hollywood. Patterson clasped his hands behind his back. But real courage, military courage, is often much quieter than that. Morrison nodded, trying to appear attentive while fighting a growing sense of unease. Real courage, Patterson continued, is a 26-year-old intelligence officer with no combat experience taking command when her convoy gets ambushed. Real courage is deliberately drawing enemy fire away from wounded soldiers. Real courage is staying conscious and giving orders while burning debris pins you under a collapsed building. The color drained from Morrison's face. Around the mess hall, experienced soldiers were looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. General Patterson. Sarah's voice came from the mess hall entrance. She walked toward them with calm confidence, her scars clearly visible in the overhead lighting. Captain Martinez. Patterson's demeanor immediately warmed. Perfect timing. I was just having a discussion with Private Morrison about courage and leadership. Sarah joined them at the table, her presence somehow making Morrison feel even smaller. I hope it's been educational, sir. Oh, I think it will be. Patterson looked directly at Morrison. Private, I'd like you to meet Captain Sarah Martinez. Perhaps you've seen her around the base? Morrison's voice was barely a whisper. Yes, sir. Captain Martinez here has an interesting background. Started as an intelligence analyst. Never expected to see combat. But sometimes the Army has different plans for us. Doesn't it, Captain? It does indeed, sir. Patterson's voice grew stronger, carrying to every corner of the mess hall. 3 years ago, Captain Martinez's convoy was ambushed outside Kandahar. The convoy commander was killed immediately. The communications specialist was critically wounded. 6 soldiers trapped under heavy machine gun fire, looking to a desk officer with no combat training to save their lives. Morrison couldn't look away from Sarah's face, seeing her scars in an entirely different light now. Now, Private Morrison, what do you think most people would do in that situation? Fresh lieutenant? Never been shot at? Responsible for 6 lives? Morrison didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Most people would panic. Patterson continued. Find the safest cover and call for backup. Hope someone else could solve the problem. But Captain Martinez did something different. She made herself the target. The general's voice rose slightly. She deliberately exposed herself to enemy fire to give her soldiers cover to reach safety. Took a direct RPG hit to the building she was in. Stayed conscious and in command while trapped under burning debris for 8 minutes. 8 minutes of giving orders while her uniform caught fire. Morrison was staring at the floor now, his face flushed with shame. All 6 soldiers survived, Patterson said. Every single one. because a scared lieutenant with no business being in a firefight decided that their lives were more important than her own safety. He paused, letting the words sink in. Captain Martinez was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and promoted to captain from her hospital bed. Sarah remained silent, allowing the general to tell her story. She had learned that her actions spoke louder than any words she could add. But that's not why we're here today, Patterson continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. We're here because I understand there was some discussion earlier about scars and what they represent. Morrison's shoulders sagged. You see, Private Morrison, in special operations we have a tradition. When someone does something extraordinary, something that defines who they are as a soldier, they earn a call sign, a name that follows them for the rest of their career. The mess hall was absolutely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to listen. Captain Martinez earned her call sign that day in Kandahar. Would you like to know what it is? Morrison nodded miserably. Patterson's voice rang out clear and strong. Phoenix. The name hung in the air like a challenge. Around the mess hall, soldiers began to straighten in their chairs. Some of them whispered the name to each other. With obvious reverence, Phoenix, Patterson repeated. Because she rose from the literal ashes of that building to save her soldiers. Because she was reborn in fire and came out stronger. He looked directly at Morrison. Now tell me, Private, what do you think her scars represent? Morrison's voice cracked when he finally spoke. Courage, sir. Sacrifice. That's right. Those scars you found so amusing this morning? They're a roadmap of the moment when a young officer decided that duty meant more than safety. When she chose other people's lives over her own. Patterson's voice softened slightly. Every time Captain Martinez looks in a mirror, she sees the cost of saving 6 soldiers. And every soldier who knows her story sees exactly what courage looks like. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Private Morrison, you mentioned that your father taught you about honor and respect for fellow soldiers. Yes, ma'am. Then I'm sure he would want you to understand something important. In this army, we don't judge each other by our scars. We honor them, because scars like mine aren't signs of poor decision-making. They're proof that when everything went wrong, someone stood up and did what was necessary. General Patterson nodded approvingly. Private Morrison, you have 2 choices now. You can learn from this moment and become the kind of officer your father would be proud of. Or you can continue thinking that courage is something you can recognize by looking at someone. But I'll tell you this. If you're lucky enough to serve long enough, you'll discover that the most courageous people you meet will often be the ones carrying the heaviest scars. Morrison straightened to attention. I understand, sir. And Captain Martinez, I owe you a profound apology. My comments were inappropriate and uninformed. Sarah nodded. Apology accepted. Private. We all have things to learn. Patterson clapped his hands once. Excellent. Now then, since we're all here, let me tell you about some other call signs you might hear around this base, and the stories behind them. For the next 30 minutes, General Patterson regaled the new recruits with tales of heroism and sacrifice. Each story connected to a call sign that carried weight and meaning, far beyond a simple nickname. Morrison listened in silence, beginning to understand just how much he didn't know about the people serving around him. When the briefing ended, Morrison approached Sarah hesitantly. Captain Martinez, I know I already apologized, but I wanted you to know that I've learned something important today. About respect and about assumptions. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. What's the most important thing you learned, Private? That courage doesn't look like what I expected, and that the best officers are often the ones who've paid the highest price for their knowledge. That's a good start, Sarah replied. Now the real test is whether you remember that lesson when you're the one making decisions under pressure. As Morrison walked away, General Patterson approached Sarah. Think he learned anything? He did. Question is whether it sticks. Patterson smiled. Well, Phoenix, I have a feeling that young man just experienced the kind of lesson that changes a person. Sometimes the best education comes from realizing how much you don't know. Sarah touched her scars once more, watching Morrison rejoin his fellow recruits. The scars would always be with her, a permanent reminder of the day she discovered who she really was. But moments like this reminded her why the pain had been worth it. Not just for the 6 soldiers she had saved, but for all the young officers who would learn from her example that true courage often comes with a price, and that price is always worth paying when it saves others. Private Morrison would never look at scars the same way again. And maybe, just maybe, that lesson would make him the kind of officer the Army needed him to become.